You know, growing up in Cork, Ireland, was a bit like living in a tiny, perfectly manicured box. On the outside, everything looked neat and proper, but inside, you could feel the walls closing in. My family was Protestant in a city dominated by Catholics, which already set me apart. It wasn't just the difference in Sunday services or the hymns we sang, it was the way people looked at you, the quiet reminders that you were a little off, a little unusual. I've always remembered the feeling of being on the outside, peering in at a world that seemed to move along without me, moving in rhythms I couldn't quite follow. And while I appreciated the structure and the rituals, I couldn't help but feel, even as a child, that there was something I wasn't meant to show. Something I didn't fully understand yet, that I was different in ways my small town wouldn't have accepted easily. For years, I tried to deny it. I told myself over and over, this isn't who you are, you don't want this. And in those moments, I truly didn't. I wanted to blend, to fit the mold, to have the carefree life everyone else seemed to be living. I played along in school, laughed at the jokes that didn't really land for me, and tried to act the way you were supposed to act. But the truth has a way of creeping in. Quiet at first, almost polite, but insistent, I realized I was gay, and it terrified me. Fear wasn't just about how people would react, though. I was certain they'd look at me differently. It was about how I looked at myself. It was about reconciling this inner truth with the religious framework I'd been given, the belief system that whispered that being who I truly was might be wrong. And it was lonely. Oh God, it was lonely. Some nights, I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, asking myself over and over, how can I exist like this in a world that doesn't seem to have room for me? I suppose that's why moving away became a sort of salvation. London felt vast and forgiving. The streets didn't judge, the people didn't cast side eyes, and for the first time, I could breathe without constantly checking myself. There's a kind of exhilaration in being unknown, in shedding all the labels that weighed you down for so long. And yet, even in freedom, there was a lingering question I couldn't shake. Where did God fit into all of this? If the universe, or whatever force you believe in, had plans for me, how could it reconcile my being gay with the faith I'd been raised to respect? I remember thinking, perhaps naively, that maybe God had made a mistake with me. And in the quiet moments, I'd wrestle with that thought endlessly, turning it over like a puzzle I couldn't solve. But here's the surprising thing. Over time, I discovered that faith isn't a rigid box, and God isn't the sort of figure to sit in judgment over our hearts. Faith, for me, became more about presence than dogma. It became about recognizing that every part of me, every joy and every fear is acknowledged in the larger tapestry of existence. And you start to see that maybe God doesn't demand conformity, but authenticity. There's a kind of peace in that realization, a gentle unburdening, a quiet knowing that being true to yourself isn't just allowed, it's necessary. And it's funny, isn't it, how the very thing you've been taught to suppress can eventually become the key to understanding your place in the world. Of course, it wasn't always easy. There were moments when the world reminded me that acceptance isn't universal. Even as I carved out my life, pursued a career, and found joy in comedy and connection, there were reminders that society's prejudices lingered. Traditional institutions, particularly religious ones, still held fear and prejudice like shields. Some people would have called it judgment. I called it bewildering. I often wondered, why does acceptance feel like an optional extra for some, a luxury that only a few are allowed to have? And yet, for every door closed, I discovered another opening, a friend, a supportive colleague, a conversation that reminded me that humanity is more complex than the binaries we impose upon it. I suppose there's also something to be said about the courage it takes just to speak honestly about who you are. I've always tried to embrace that courage, whether it was in interviews, on stage, or in private conversations. And speaking out wasn't just about me. It was about anyone who felt silenced, unseen, or unworthy of recognition. And every time I shared my story, however wittily or carefully, I felt a connection to something larger, a community of souls seeking acceptance, understanding, and truth. And that connection, I think, is sacred in itself, yet even amidst progress and visibility, the inner questions persisted. I'd catch myself wondering how different life might have been if my upbringing had been more accepting, if my community had seen me as I was, rather than as a deviation from some expected norm. Some people might say that being raised in that environment forced a deeper introspection, a more profound understanding of both faith and self. Others might argue it simply caused unnecessary struggle. I think it's a bit of both. It's messy, it's human, and it's instructive. And perhaps that's the point. There isn't a single right way to navigate belief and identity. There is only the way you live it fully and honestly. So when I think about finding God while being gay, I realize it's not about reconciling two opposing forces, it's about integrating them. It's about seeing that every aspect of who you are, your fears, your loves, your joys, your doubts, is sacred in its own right. And for me, that integration came slowly, with missteps and revelations, with humor and with tears. It came through conversations, reflections, and the quiet acceptance that some questions may never have clear answers. And in that uncertainty, there's a kind of freedom. The freedom to define faith on your own terms, to allow spirituality to meet identity without judgment or fear. I remember once sitting quietly in a chapel long after everyone had gone, feeling an odd sense of calm. There was no sermon, no judgment, no gaze of society upon me, just a sense of stillness. I realized then that perhaps faith is less about answers and more about presence. It's about noticing, paying attention, and allowing yourself to exist fully. And I suppose in that moment, I began to understand that finding God isn't a destination. It's a journey, sometimes joyful, sometimes painful, sometimes confusing, and always deeply personal. And you see, what's extraordinary is that once you allow yourself to accept that, everything shifts. The fear that once felt suffocating becomes a teacher. The shame that lingered in quiet corners is transformed into compassion for yourself and for others. You start to understand that love, in all its forms, is the truest reflection of faith. It's not in rigid adherence to rules, but in the courage to show up fully and honestly in every part of your life. So when people ask me now about God, or about faith, or about how to reconcile identity and belief, I tell them this: there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. Some find it in ritual, some in community, some in silent reflection. Some never find it at all, and that's okay too. The key is to remain open, to remain authentic, and to trust that being fully yourself is not only allowed, but sacred. And maybe, just maybe, that's the closest any of us will come to understanding God. Not as a figure of judgment, but as a mirror reflecting our own authenticity back to us. And that, I've found, is enough. Enough to breathe, enough to laugh, enough to feel the full weight and beauty of life without apology. And if I've learned anything over the years, it's that embracing your own story in all its messiness, all its contradictions, all its wonders is perhaps the most spiritual act of all.